Start recording. Wonderful. Okay, well, officially welcome everyone to MESA's monthly webinar, hosted on topics related to agroecology and food systems, typically on every third Tuesday of the month. As I mentioned, we typically do longer introductions where we all unmute and share with the group where we're tuning in from. But today I think we're going to keep it in the chat only, and then feel free to scroll through and see where others are joining from there. Today we'll be together for an hour, so until 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. And we are joined today by not one but three guest presenters who will present for about 30 minutes and introduce themselves. And then we'll transition into a question and answer session that will carry us to the end of our time together. And then, following the session, this recording will be shared to MESA's YouTube, where you can also find all of the recordings for past webinars. So that's a great place to check out if you're curious. And a note just kind of on best practices for the session is, as questions come up, please save them and either note them in the chat or write them down, and then we will make sure to get to them at the end. But for just kind of the sake of respecting the presenter's time, we'll stay on mute while they're presenting, and then use the space afterwards to get any questions we have answered. So with that, I am really honored to hand it over to three friends and colleagues who will be introducing themselves and their work, and then transitioning into their presentation. So with that, yes, whoever would like to begin, the stage is yours. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for having us today. Good afternoon, everyone. Our presentation today is Decolonizing Agriculture, a case study of chakras in the Amazonian Ecuador. My name is Linda Xiong, and I'm joining from Denver, Colorado. We honor and acknowledge that the land on which I reside is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Riebe, and I live in Wisconsin in the Milwaukee area. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations reside.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandria Sedar. I'm calling from what is called Chicago, Illinois. This is the ancestral home of what's referred to as the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Adwa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Fox, also called this area home. This region, especially along the shores of Lake Michigan, has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. And today, Chicago is home of one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States. And members of this community continue to contribute to the life of the city, celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We are so happy to share this work with you. It's something we put a lot of love into, something that's very close to our hearts. And before we begin, we've already acknowledged the Indigenous land that we reside on, but we also wanted to give a little more context to our relationship with the Quechua. So while we feel we have a good grasp of the role of chakras in Quechua life, we want to acknowledge that our understanding is partial, incomplete, and at times flawed. It is not our intention to speak for the Quechua, and we believe they have the right to self-determination as all peoples do. We do, however, come alongside them, joining their voices in declaring that their right to their ancestral lands and way of life be respected.
Our presentation today will cover the impact of outside forces on Indigenous people, their lives and culture. Our presentation will show the interconnectedness of people to the environment and of people to other people, listening and learning from those who are often most marginalized. About 370 million people identify as Indigenous, representing about 4,000 Indigenous peoples and speaking around 5,000 different languages. Indigenous people represent 5% of the world population and disproportionately 15% of the world's poor. Indigenous people all over the world experience different challenges based on their geography and local circumstances, for example, but they share commonalities. Outside forces like colonization have rarely worked to the benefit of Indigenous people. They have been routinely dispossessed of their traditional hereditary assets, an example being traditional agricultural practices. With climate change and increasing land appropriation, Indigenous growing practices are suffering with this intrusion from the outside world. And today we'll be examining chakras, a traditional agroforestry method used by the Quichua people of the Ecuadorian Amazon.
The Quichua are the largest Indigenous people group in Ecuador, with about 80,000 living in the country. Our study looks at the Quichua of Napo province, where Tena is the capital. Napo province is located in the Amazon rainforest. Agroforestry is a system where trees, crops, and animals grow together in harmony. The Quichua practice a traditional agricultural growing method called chakras. Chakras are modified forests inhabited by a diversity of plants and often animals. Quichua families spend significant time in their chakras, which provide food and nutritional resources. Apart from contributing to food and nutrition security, chakras also play a strong role in cultural identity and belonging. Ecosystems, goods, and services are essential for life. Goods like water, food and wood for fuel and shelter, and services like water purification, recreation, and soil formation are all gifts from nature. Chakras are a rich source of ecosystems, goods, and services for the Quichua and also for the world. Both plant and animal biodiversity are maintained in chakras because of their forest-like quality, and they act as corridors of migration for species. When species become extinct, it upsets the balance of nature. Insects and other animals live in these plots and enable seed dispersal and pollination to take place. Chakras are important because they act as safety nets during periods of hardship caused by the weather, economic times, or other factors, by providing food for forage, a source of fuel and fodder, and so on. Objects used in religious ceremonies, entertainment, and art are collected from chakras, and also different items to eat, drink, and treat health concerns. Animal droppings, leaves, and plant remains add nutrients to the soil, while roots help aerate and anchor the soil. Trees and plants are very important in the mitigation of climate change, and the Amazon rainforest is sometimes referred to as the lungs of our planet.
Despite the many benefits of chakras, their use is declining. Now, there's many factors that have contributed to this decline, and it dates back as far as the 1990s and happened to coincide with Ecuador's worst economic crisis. This period was followed by the construction of heavy oil pipelines, increased drilling in virgin forests, and the beginning of increased settlement in the Amazon, from both within Ecuador and from other parts of South America, such as Colombia and Venezuela. Chakras not only play a key role in the well-being and culture of the Quichua, but serve a crucial role in climate regulation, carbon sequestration, and many other vital ecosystems, goods, and services that Katherine outlined. So this makes declined chakra use not just a problem for the Quichua, but in reality a problem for us all. So what you see here is a systems map we created of the factors contributing to decreased chakra use and their connections. We have it here just to demonstrate complexity, and we don't expect you to read every loop and connection. You can, however, see from the legend in the lower left-hand corner that we have grouped the factors together by cultural and social, health, environment, government, and policy. And before we take a deeper look at the problem, we wanted to explain our methods and why we chose this topic. For me, this project is meaningful both because of my time spent living in Ecuador, but also because of my Indigenous heritage. My grandparents always had a large garden and made a point to have me and my sister tend to it with them, so they could share their knowledge of plants. And as I took part in this sacred ritual of growing food, beauty, and medicine, I became intimately acquainted with the inherent connection we all share with the earth. When I conducted fieldwork in Tena, Ecuador during the summer of 2018, I interviewed a variety of Indigenous people who felt this same connection, albeit a little bit more profound. In addition to the interviews I conducted in Ecuador, our project was informed by interviews we collectively did in the fall of 2018 when this work began. This allowed us to incorporate perspectives from Indigenous people, researchers, policymakers, global and local development organizations, and social enterprise entrepreneurs. We also did an extensive literature review and analyzed ecological data, such as deforestation rates in the Amazon. We took this data and conducted a systems analysis, and the result is the map you see here.
As you can see from our Kumu map, the system we've decided to focus on is complex, with many intersecting and reinforcing factors. The plight of the Quechua is similar to that of Indigenous peoples around the world, like the Arctic people of Canada and Greenland, and to rural peoples in many colonized countries like Nigeria. Both my grandfathers were farmers in Nigeria, and land was very important to them. In addition, like Ecuador, Nigeria has also experienced the resource curse and has had significant environmental damage done by the oil industry, and vast swaths of primary forests have been destroyed by logging.
For me, I was drawn to the chakra growing system and the Quechua people due to my experience working in social enterprises. In my experience, I found that while social enterprises had good intentions, their impact often did not address the social and cultural context of their work because it was challenging to work within and against a capitalist system. So this can be seen through the experiences of the Quechua and other Indigenous people. Given the lack of a trade-based economy to rebuild their chakras, houses, and communities, Indigenous people had to integrate into a post-colonial way of life. And once in the capitalist system, their survival depended on income. So after creating an extensive map of many contributing factors, we pared it down to 3 key contributing factors, which I've listed here, that ultimately lead to the decline use of chakras. So they are poverty, search for economic opportunities, and government policies. So income poverty is a result of integrating into a post-colonial way of life. While poverty rates in Ecuador have declined between 2000 and 2010, gaps still exist. So 63% of households with Indigenous heads are affected by income poverty, compared to 29% of households of white or mixed heads. Poverty leads to a search for economic opportunities all over Ecuador. The system is also compounded by government policies which have acknowledged Indigenous rights while providing incentives for extractive and agricultural industries in the Amazon rainforest. The Quechua people are integrating into a market economy, growing traditional foods for commercialization. As a result, these products are taking up more and more space in chakras, trending towards monocropping, which is the growing of a single crop in a large area.
In addition to this, to take advantage of economic opportunities, many Indigenous people moved to cities, ultimately resulting in less participation in cultural practices and traditions like chakras. This is due in part to lack of youth involvement in key cultural practices and with their identification with traditional Quechua culture, but also in large part to the changing role of women who do the majority of work in chakras and who prepare traditional foods. Also motivated by economic opportunities, other impoverished populations migrate to the Amazon to work in agricultural and extractive industries. In addition to contributing to the urbanization of the region, these populations contribute to the clearing of land for extraction, livestock, monocropping, and settlement, resulting in less land available for chakras.
Chakras have environmental importance. Abandoned chakras can relatively quickly revert back to forests and continue to be a source of multiple ecosystems, goods, and services. However, new land practices, especially the removal of tree and plant cover, expose the soil to the elements and discourages the absorption of nutrients. Environmental degradation is serious because it plays a role in climate change, the economic status of the Quechua, their food security, and health. In addition, the destruction of Quechua land has a social cultural dimension because their tie to the land is so strong. Poverty and environmental degradation often go hand in hand. One can cause the other. For example, people who are impoverished often rely on what they can get free from nature. Thus, trees are often cut for firewood, to sell for income, or to carve out land for agriculture. Such practices might make sense in the short term, but often end up having a negative effect on their future. Sometimes it is not even the people themselves who cause the destruction, but outsiders who swoop in with activities that degrade the land and then leave, taking no responsibility for the environmental chaos they leave behind. Environmental degradation can cause poverty because people who depend on the land find that the land can no longer provide for their needs.
Many solutions are also present in the system and involve many stakeholders who are working on different aspects of the system. So we have organized our solutions based on scale. We have the local or the Ecuadorian level, and then the global level. One initiative from the Ecuadorian government is the Sociobosque program. This program provides direct monetary incentives to communities for voluntary conservation of native forests or ecosystem. Also, Ecuador's national development plan, called the Plan Nacional de Buen Vivir, is based on indigenous knowledge. This indicates a shift in national values and mental models surrounding indigenous people and their knowledge. However, there are still issues with implementation and adherence to multiple, often contradictory laws. In the private sector, social enterprise models have been used to bring chakra products into the global market. So Runa and Waikana are two companies who focus mainly on guayusa tea products. Guayusa is a tree that's native to the Amazon, and its leaves are used by indigenous peoples as a tea beverage. So while social enterprise models encourage the use of chakras, they also face many challenges, right? The marketplace is driven by supply, demand, and price, and also full of competition who may not hold the same values. Also, an evaluation of Runa's model found that there was actually an increase of clearing of land to grow more guayusa, leaning towards monoculture, and in turn, potential environmental degradation.
One strategy from the government and non-government development organizations has been leveraging change at the consumer level by creating indigenous-centered supply chains. So organizations such as Canopy Bridge, located in Quito, Ecuador, connect Amazonian indigenous farmers to restaurants in Quito and are creating menus with a variety of products bought from each family's chakra. So this not only incentivizes chakra use and increases economic security for the Quechua farmer, but also provides an opportunity to share indigenous growing and culinary traditions with those who may have little interaction with this population. On the global scale, there's also indigenous activism that's moving change. So indigenous organizations around the world have been strong forces in promoting indigenous agricultural practices and gaining and protecting land rights, as well as bringing the indigenous voice to global settings. Pictured on this slide is Tuntia Katan, at least as of 2018, he was the vice president of COICA, and he was one of the people we interviewed for this project. Last November, in the November of 2019, he addressed leaders from around the world at the UN Conference on Biodiversity to advocate for the Amazon Basin and the inclusion of the indigenous voice in policy. We also see the indigenous voice being brought to and increasingly centered in the global development sector. First Peoples Worldwide is an indigenous-led nonprofit that funds local development projects in indigenous communities around the world. The organization facilitates the use of indigenous knowledge to address global problems such as climate change, food security, and sustainable development. In another place, we notice the increased incorporation of Indigenous knowledge is institutions of higher education. One example is the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law. They not only provide financial support, strategic planning, and technical assistance to Indigenous growers, but they also ensure that Indigenous knowledge is honored and not dispossessed from the Indigenous people themselves. So on that same map we showed earlier, we highlighted factors that are directly impacted by the current solutions landscape, so everything that we just summarized. And as you can see, the majority are in the environmental sector, with some in the economic and a few related to the government and culture sector. So while these programs have had some success, there are still gaps. For example, in the economic sector, the current solutions focus on the creation of a market for chakra products. While these measures address immediate financial needs of the Quechua, they leave factors like poverty and the financial incentives attached to extraction industries unaddressed. This makes achieving sustainable economic security unlikely. In addition, many of these solutions also encourage Indigenous people to enter an economic system that often excludes the Indigenous voice. There are also important parts of the system that remain relatively untouched, like health and nutrition security and deeper structural influences of colonialism.
Of the many factors at play in this system, we have identified 4 that we think are key. These all directly affect the well-being of the Quechua and deal with issues of land ownership, how much freedom the private sector has to do whatever it wants, how ecosystems, goods, and services are valued, and the need for Quechua involvement in all levels of government and decision-making. Indigenous land rights are important. In 2016, over 70 million acres of forest was lost, which is about the size of New Zealand. According to the Rainforest Alliance, although experts have offered compelling evidence that securing land rights for Indigenous forest communities leads to stronger, healthier forests, the majority of these communities still lack the legal rights to their ancestral lands. Mining, logging, and monocropping are all activities which threaten Quechua land and put stress on the environment. Some activities are carried out illegally, and many are questionable ethically. Damage done to the environment and misdeeds committed are often not atoned for. Ecosystems, goods, and services are plentiful in supply in the rainforest. As such, many have flocked there to get a share of the pie. This has resulted in indiscriminate use and a heavy burden placed on ecosystems, goods, and services. Many decisions are made with financial profit in mind, not the impact they will have on the environment. Colonization is characterized by those in charge making decisions about and for the colonized. The Quechua are marginalized because they often have no say in the making of policies that affect them. The levers of change are areas where steps can be taken to address factors that prevent the well-being of the Quechua. There is a need for the rights of Indigenous peoples to be formally recognized and codified so that their land cannot be taken away from them or encroached on. In addition, buffer zones should exist so that commercial activities with negative impacts do not adversely affect their livelihoods and way of life because of proximity. The private sector should not be allowed to act with impunity. The government should not cater more to international interests than it does to its own people. Business ethics and environmental stewardship should be required and strictly enforced. The Ecuadorian government, national and international corporations must recognize free, prior, and informed consent, which the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations describes as a specific right to give or withhold consent to a project that may affect Indigenous peoples or their territories, and once the consent is given, to withdraw it at any stage. The world cannot continue to bear the heavy global burden of resource consumption and environmental destruction that is taking place without eventually tipping into an alternate state. Ecosystems, goods, and services are vital for the Quechua and the entire planet. The impact on these goods and services must be factored into decision-making, as well as the environmental legacy for future generations. Effective, equitable policies and mechanisms need to be crafted with all stakeholders participating. The Quechua must have a say on issues that affect them. For example, Sustainable Development Goal 16.7 calls for ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels.
So in our complex systems map, we have highlighted factors impacted by levers of change with a red shadow. Now, together, you can see that our levers of change expand solutions into areas like food systems. So they also address gaps that make the solutions landscape even more robust. The lives of Indigenous people are complex. The use of chakras among the Quechua is an environmental justice issue and impacts intergenerational equity. In addition, the co-benefits of chakra use are significant, and agroforestry methods are being praised for mitigating climate change and promoting environmental stewardship.
The current model of globalization is founded on colonization and inequity. The severing of cultural identity from food, agriculture, and the environment has led to a lack of factoring in externalities in the global system and the devaluation of Indigenous people, their knowledge, and their voice.
While some progress has been made, there are still power imbalances that do not center the Indigenous voice or recognize the value of the environment for its whole rather than its parts. Therefore, the potential for sustainable, large-scale change lies in not only changing how we view the system, but changing how we value it. This is perhaps the most important gap to address, because after all, in the words of one Indigenous cacao farmer, protecting the forest is important to the people and for our children's future, because the forest is, in reality, a mother to us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Letting all of that sink in, and it's so rich, so much there. I'd love to move now into questions that have come up for any of the audience members. I know Daisy, welcome Daisy, you joined towards the end, but anything that has come up for anyone, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute and ask the speakers directly. Yeah, this space from starting now until really the end of our session or the end of our time together is dedicated to questions. So feel free to share yours now.
Thank you very much. That's very informative. Maybe you say that Alexandria, I think, but I just don't remember. I was curious about how many participants do you have in the interviews that you conducted in Ecuador?
And total in Ecuador alone, it was about 14. And then there were additional interviews that we did virtually from the United States. And then we used data from interviews other people did.
Oh, okay. It was Ecuador the interviews only? Because you mentioned a couple sections, but I was a bit confused with that part.
Yeah, just in Ecuador's. Oh, sorry, keep going. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I just remember you mentioning like the other countries, Venezuela and Peru, Chile, and Estonia. I wasn't clear.
Yeah, those were just mentioned for like the migration. So that was something that was brought up by multiple participants, is that because in Ecuador, the oil industry paid more than other neighboring countries, and the open border policy that Ecuador had in place at the time, there was an increased immigration from Colombia and Venezuela to that region to work in those industries. And that was taking some of the land that has been initially called autonomous indigenous land, but Ecuador's constitution is a little complicated in that way, where it says it's autonomous indigenous land unless it's in direct conflict with national economic needs. So yeah, so that was kind of where that came in, was mostly mentioning migration.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Thanks, Rosa. Anyone else? Feel free, again, in the chat. You can post yours there, or unmute. I do have a question, and it was, you mentioned several different incentive programs, or I guess that were both, you know, in different veins. So one was in like the government sector. I think it was, yeah, Programa Socio Bosque, and another one that I'm forgetting the name of. But I'm curious also in your research if it came up at all, any metrics on how effective these are in you know, doing what they're intended to do, which is to incentivize conservation, specifically around land, or the use of land it as in chakra form. I don't know if that's the correct way to say that, but I'm like, you know, balancing that with the reality of like this imperialist pressure that is coming in for the Guyasa tea, and you know, as was mentioned, kind of this really hard to swallow irony of the fact that this product that's growing out of this certain type of indigenous system is then an incentive for clear cuts to happen and kind of monocrop agriculture to take over. And so I'm just curious about the effectiveness of these governments like solutions, and other agencies solutions to this issue, or to these issues.
I mean, I don't remember. I think they are somewhat, I don't have a number in mind. I mean, I can go back into our research paper and see. I think they are somewhat effective in that there is a monetary incentive to it. The only caveat is that it's voluntary, right? And so I don't know how it is, like you were saying, how it fares against international market, and like using your land to make money off of it versus conserving it in some ways. We did see this program in other countries around the world of providing incentives, but I don't know off the top of my head like a percentage of like whether it's successful.
Sure.
So I apologize for that, but we
No.
can follow up.
Yeah. Yeah, even a general trend in like has, I guess, the destruction of, or yeah, I guess the use, what is the use, the pattern of use look like of chakras, or the presence of chakras. I hesitate to say use, because even that feels like an extractive kind of term, but like yeah, I guess, have they persisted? I guess is what I'm asking. Or yeah, what does that trend look like just in terms of their pervasiveness? Yeah.
I'll put an article in the chat, and then I know I've taken up a lot of airtime, so if Linda or Catherine want to go in, but this is a recent program from 2023 that's actually helping support the Amazonian chakra. So it's still hanging in there, that form of relation with the land.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Also, just something to, earlier, we talked a lot when we were doing this project. So some context, the presentation was modified from what we used at the Oxford systems mapping competition. So the format was largely informed by that outline. And as we were doing it, I mean, the solutions are not bad, right? It's better to have a government at least trying than rolling over their rights. But we did talk about fundamentally the issue is Indigenous folks not being able to maintain a traditional lifestyle and like feed their families and keep their land. That's increasingly not becoming an option. So with the Socio Bosque program, I just looked up some statistics. They're 20-year leases to the family, and their goal is 16% of Ecuadorian landmass. So that's great that they can have that. And what happens when, so something else we saw in our research was people actually voluntarily selling their land because they wanted their children to pursue an education and they had to pay inscription fees and they didn't have money for that. So I think there's this balance of honoring Indigenous land, like their land rights, but also Indigenous ways of life. That's kind of increasingly absent. I think there's more movement around that, but it's not even just about people being able to have their land, but can they survive and live full lives in their traditional ways. And when we say traditional, we mean there's modern iterations of it. Indigenous folks have self-determination. They can choose to live how they'd like, but it's very often that they're forced into this capitalist society. You can have your land as long as you grow something that has a profit on it, or you can have this as long as we can take some of it when we need it. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I feel like that's really so well articulated in that governments are like, okay, we'll honor Indigenous land, but that's where kind of we stop, right? And there's the cultural, which I mean is so intertwined with land that like you can't separate the two, and yet the government does for kind of their own maintaining their own power and their own narratives around the good that they're doing, which is arguably not good. So yeah, thank you for that. We
Yes.
had a few people join. Oh, sorry, Katherine, go ahead.
No, Sarah joined. No, and one thing I wanted to point out is when we use the word conserve, like conservation, paying people to conserve land, the government's definition of conservation may be different. So Indigenous people, they do use the land, they live off the land, but at the same time, they keep it, in a healthy fashion. But what they do may not fit what the government thinks conservation should look like. So there could be a little bit of a tension there. So Lauren's question in the chat, how did three of you decide to focus on chakras in Ecuador? So this actually came out of a class, and the three of us were put in the same group. We did a Master of Sustainable Peace Building together, and we were put in a group, and we were actually primarily, what were we looking at? Economic security, food security, and cultural expression,
Mhm. Yeah.
maintenance, cultural, what was it?
Traditional, like traditional knowledge.
Yeah, expression of traditional knowledge or something like that. And we had as a partner was a vice president of sort of like an indigenous university in Ecuador. So we were virtual. This was before the pandemic. We actually had virtual meetings with him every week, almost every week. And so we did work primarily on Guayusa at that time. And then later, the opportunity to compete in Oxford came up. And so we used some of that research, but now we were looking at chakras as an expression of colonization, decolonization. We're looking at the effect of colonization on Indigenous life and using chakras to represent that. And for those of you who want to look at another like a good story about the impact of the outside world on Indigenous life is Silent Snow by what's her name again? Is it
Marla?
Martha Cole?
Marla Cohn.
Yeah, great book, really great book, Silent Snow. So yeah.
Yeah. And I had experience working in fair trade industries and thinking about how social enterprises play a role. So coming from an economic security perspective too. So that was kind of my, I don't want to say expertise, but that was my area of interest, which ballooned into this as well.
And I had, before the class project, I had lived in Ecuador for a little over a year, studying and working. I actually did youth conflict resolution work initially. And then, so I was excited. I'm like, oh, this is about Ecuador. I'll get on the project. And then through that, I created a field work around it, and Katherine did as well. And I think, Linda, you looped in some of this to other projects. So it kind of started as a class assignment that grew into so many things for all of us.
Yes, it was interesting. Waikana, they were hoping to break into that's guayusa, so a tea-like drink, into the American, well, international and American market. So for the first year I did my field work was doing like pilots. It was like taste tests for the guayusa, like what kind of product would they prefer, and why, and the demographics and things like that. And we haven't followed up with them most recently. I don't know if either of you have, what happened with all that. But again, you see the tension of, even if you are trying to provide sort of what fair trade does, like a living wage and good conditions and things like that, is that going to sort of incentivize people to monocrop? So one of the things that one of the guys at Waikana was doing was, they were not only buying guayusa, but they were also buying other things that were produced in the chakras. So trying not to have them just focus on guayusa to the detriment of other products. And we didn't say this, but some chakras support up to 50 different products, plants, animals, and other things. So you can see how important chakras are to the food security of Indigenous peoples. So if they clear that and they're only growing one product or two, how much can they afford to buy in the market, where before they had these all, in their gardens. So it's a huge impact.
Thank you. Any questions related to what we've been talking about, or from any part of the presentation that haven't been shared already? Again, for those who came in late, to this recording will be shared to Miss's YouTube as well as the transcript, so you'll have access to all of the resources and the presentation itself after the fact. Okay. It looks like that was all the questions that came up. So with that, thank you all so much. Truly, I'm really inspired. I want to talk to each of you individually. I'm super interested in all the work that you're doing. And then I keep having to remind myself, like, oh, you have to facilitate this too. I'm just like going on these. Yeah, I'm so thank you so much for coming on and sharing your work. And
Sabrina, can I say something?
yeah, of course.
I forgot to say this earlier, but for those who have done TAP or who have looked at the agroecology flower, there are so many petals and subtopics that are pertinent to the work in the chakras, you know, not just indigenous knowledge or campesino knowledge. We have agroforestry, we've got soil conservation, we've got water conservation, we've got things like, what do you call it? The cycle, fertility cycle and things like that. So, oh, hi, Tao Shakwat. So good to see you again. Hey. So it's, you know, when we look at indigenous growing methods or their way of life, and then we put it next to our agroecology flower, we're going to see a lot of things that just, you know, interact in there and are really like concrete examples of what we learn in class. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's a great connection, and I think maybe is something that we can bring in your research into the upcoming TAP course in some capacity. I'm not sure how, but give it a little highlight or share this presentation with the cohort. So yeah, thanks for making that mention. And yeah, with that, thank you to all of our speakers. An honor to have you with us today. Thank you to everyone who attended. Like I said, you'll receive follow-up information about this session as soon as I have it uploaded. And with that, I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next month. And would also love any of the speakers just final parting words or closing remarks. You're welcome to do that now. If not, we can wrap up the session.
I do. I think, you know, with our agroecology flower and what we learn in class, something that's, you know, really important now is like for those, well, okay, so a lot of okay, let me go a different way. I was going to talk about the IRA and the BIL, you know, just the bills that have been passed and just the opportunities for people to take advantage of them. But even for those that are coming from other countries, you know, some of you didn't do TAP, but in TAP, we talked about the planetary boundaries and how we can tip into alternate states. So a lot of these topics, you know, deal with that. If we don't, you know, if we don't slow down this, or if we don't do this, the threat of tipping into an alternate state is really eminent, really. And we can see that a lot through the weather and, you know, natural disasters and things like that. So agroforestry, not agroforestry, agroecology, even though many people have not heard about it in day-to-day life, it's something that we can slowly and gradually introduce to people in our circles. And the more people are educated about these things, the wiser choices they can make. So I'd like to encourage you all with that.
Just for me, like my perspective is just to like, or my parting words is to like, don't forget the people in our connections to the land and your personal connection to, of course, I think I'm speaking, preaching to the choir here, but also that like with all these methods and these solutions, that there are people, there are cultures there that is behind what we do and what we practice every day. So
Thank you, Linda.
I think just for me, gratitude. I think my colleagues have left a lot of the really big, beautiful messages, but I'm grateful to be here in community with you all. And it just always inspires me to see folks dedicated to continuing this relation with the land. I think for me, sometimes you lose hope, man, especially living in this big old city, Chicago. You forget that there are people out there who do care about keeping that connection alive, but also sharing it with the people around us, with the next generation. I think we talk a lot about our ancestors in our group when we were doing this work, and our family, and just that we're all in relation to each other as children of the earth. And I'm glad that we're here and doing this work. So I just have gratitude that you came here today, but also that you're deepening your knowledge and sharing it with others. So thank you all.
Thank you, Alexandria. And yeah, I really appreciated just your use of the word love in this work. And I think that's what I've felt throughout your presentation and from each one of you. So much gratitude back to you all. And with that, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And
Thank you.
all. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.